Thanks very much for the warm welcome to chilly and white Ottawa. It's really beautiful out here. It was nice to fly in and see a little bit of snow. I tell my students that in the future that might be a rare phenomenon. It's really nice to see right now. And it was terrific driving up here and driving along the river and watching the people skating. I have a Dutch background, and my dad used to have a picture of the skaters and the canals of the Netherlands hanging on the wall in his study. And seeing that driving up here made me think of that picture he had on the wall. But it hardly ever happens anymore in Holland, so be happy you still have it here. Today I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the European situation related to energy, and I'm going to focus on two elements. There's of course many, many elements that we could be talking about. One is the question of Europe's energy dependency, import dependency. The other is the link to climate change. What that means for Europe in its efforts to create an energy union, given the very different national trajectories that we see in Europe. Just as a background and a trajectory for those of you who are not so familiar with the European situation, the European Union has always had energy as an area of national sovereignty. But over time, the efforts on the Europeans to create a more harmonized approach to energy has led to the creation of what is known as the Energy Union. And the Energy Union has a few areas of focus to it. One is to think about how Europe can strengthen its energy security, having enough energy, making sure you always have enough energy. The second is to create a more unified energy structure, to internalize energy as part of the European market structure. That's very much linked to questions of the future. How do we modernize? How do we create economies of the future in the energy world? How do we link that to the demand structures for energy in Europe? And very much, how do we do this in a way that goes towards a decarbonized European energy structure? The European situation is very different from the Canadian. Europe imports over 50% of its energy. Europe is highly, highly dependent on energy from abroad. And this costs Europe an awful lot, as you said in your beginning comments, that Europe is pouring money into the outside world in order to get the energy it needs to drive its economy. And over the last several years, maybe the last decade or two, you're starting to hear more of a refrain. Why are we doing this? Why aren't we investing this money in Europe instead of sending it off into countries that have regimes that have different values than are prominent in Europe? Many of the regimes from which the oil or gas is coming have less strong democratic traditions. But Europe has a big way to go to get to this decarbonized energy world. We've heard about some of the positive developments. I'll talk about them a little as well, but there's still an awful lot to do. 75% of Europe's housing structure needs to be modernized if you're going to reduce the emissions by 80%. And I can tell you from the hotel I'm staying in here in Ottawa, you've got the same problem. Looking at the window in that hotel and just feeling the cold air coming through the window, there's a lot that needs to be done to modernize cities, rural areas. It's a common problem we're all going to have. Transport sector we've already talked about. I'll mention it a little bit more, but I can't cover everything. I already said it, the EU, did you know it's the world's largest importer of energy? What a different situation from what you have here in Canada, where you are swimming in coal and oil, shale gas, shale oil. Europe is in a very, very different situation. And you can see that here. I have a huge number of graphs and maps, and I'm probably going to overwhelm you with them all. But here you can see the different dependence different EU member states have on imported energy. Some of the smaller states, Cyprus, Malta, Luxembourg, Ireland, Belgium, Lithuania, Portugal, are 75% or more dependent on energy imports. Even big countries like Germany, it's over 60% of its energy is being imported from abroad. That's a lot of money that you're pumping into other parts of the world. Here you see that graphically. The darker the color, the more the dependence on energy imports from abroad. Look at Italy. Italy is over 75% dependent on energy from abroad to meet its economic needs. And of course, that impacts a lot how you think about energy questions. EU energy production in 2015, this is not electricity, this is total energy. You can see that, maybe I said that wrong, maybe this is electricity, this looks like electricity to me. That very heavy dependence on coal, although, as was mentioned, we're starting to see renewables add up to more than coal. If you combine the hydro and the renewables, you're now at 29%. So there you're starting to see a shift in the direction of renewables, but also a big nuclear sector. And I mention that because that's one of the areas where Europe is in a difficult situation, countries who have different views on nuclear. I'll come back to that in a minute. What we also know for Europe is that the energy situation is a really important part of international security relations. Russia is so important to Europe's economy because so much of European gas and oil comes from Russia. There are efforts to try to diversify those sources of imports. Nevertheless, Russia remains the EU's single most important energy partner. Russia is to Europe what the United States and Canada's relationship are to each other. Of course, with Russia, it's also a complicated relationship. And if you think about how much of the gas that is being imported from Europe travels through the Ukraine, you can understand the very challenging situation of the Crimea crisis and how that impacted European positions on the Ukraine, because Europe needs that gas. And the Ukraine is central to the debate between Russia and the European Union. Russia also very important for oil. Okay, I'm going to switch track just a little bit, talk more about climate change. I don't know how much you have been following the latest statistics. 2017 was the second hottest summer a year on record. 2016 was the hottest. And if you look over the last 20 years, we have almost every year set a new record on heat. So trends are pretty dramatic in the last period of time. And you also see the growing trends on global use of energy. Here we actually see the CO2 emissions over time. When we talk about Paris and the 2-degree target, and we talk about how to reduce emissions back to 80% below 1990 levels, we're basically talking about how do we bring our emissions back down to where they were somewhere down around here. So we have a lot to do on a global level. And if we don't do this with big changes in the emissions in North America and Europe, we're not going to be able to expect the rest of the world to do it. So Europe has been very central to this debate. We had the last climate negotiations in Bonn, the Bonn Climate Conference, which was headed up by Fiji. Fiji is one of the many countries that is exposed to rising sea levels, and of course has a very strong interest in having stronger action taken. Is Europe leading? Is Europe really putting climate change high on the agenda? There's a wonderful word in German, it's called Jein. Ja means yes, nein means no, jein means well, it depends how you look at it. Where's the ja part of it? Those targets you were talking about, I disagree with you fundamentally on what you guys were saying about targets. The long-term targets are super, but if you don't have the medium targets, politicians just aren't going to move. It's the only way to put pressure on politicians. You talk to them about 2050, they will sign anything. 2050 target, 80% CO2 emission reductions, sure, where do you want my name? Who's going to be around politically in 2050? If we don't have shorter term targets, we're also not going to get industry to change. Whether or not they're realistic, whether or not they're set in a way that makes sense is a different debate. I mean, that's probably where you were going as well. Looking at the targets, Europe has targets for 2020, for 2030, for 2050. The 2020 targets, 20% greenhouse gas emission reductions, 20% renewables, 20% energy efficiency, very nice, 20, 20 by 2020. They're not so good for 2030, it's 40%, 27%, 27%. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as nicely. But you can see here the beginning of debates. When the 2030 targets in Europe were negotiated, the 40% target was a very, very important central target. Many countries in Europe wanted a higher renewable energy target but weren't able to push it through due to opposition from those countries that are very dependent on coal. And there's also a question as to whether or not nuclear should be included in the definition of renewables. I'm from Germany, I also work in a commission that's dealing with all the problems of high-level radioactive waste. I'm like, get rid of nuclear, big problems. But if you're in France, you think differently about it. And this is also a big challenge in Europe. How do we set targets that deal with the different energy interests of countries? Where are Europe's CO2 emissions coming from? A lot of it is the energy production sector and manufacturing. Households and transportation are also very important. How's Europe doing towards meeting its energy goals? Well, you can see a little bit of progress here. The green shows you what is going on in the electricity sector. And you see from 2005 to 2015 an impressive doubling of renewable energy in the electricity sector. If you look at the heating and cooling sector, the progress has been slower, 10% to 18%. And if you look at the transport sector, really slow, 1.4 to 6% improvement. So we're seeing different progress in different areas in the European Union. If we look at the big picture, how is Europe doing on greenhouse gas emission reductions? It will have no trouble meeting its 2020 target. The 2030 target will be the possibly harder target to meet. On per capita CO2 emissions, if you look at Europe, the emissions are at 6.8 tons per person. What does that mean? Most people have no idea. Saskatchewan, anybody know what Saskatchewan's emissions are? Alberta, I think it's something like 70 tons per person.
Yeah, 78.
If you believe in equality, most of us don't, but if you believe in equality and every person has the right to the same CO2 emissions, and if you believe in the 2-degree target, that would mean 2 tons per person worldwide. So that means Europe still has to go down a lot. Canada, you guys have a long ways to go, as does the United States. When I say, do you believe in equality? Obviously I believe in equality, but you will have different energy demands in different parts of the world. Nevertheless, it shows you what a challenge we've got. If we look at trajectories for EU CO2 emissions, we see the rise from 1965, these circles, and the decline that started slowly in the 1980s, and more significantly, now that we are really pushing harder with renewable energy targets and energy efficiency targets. Although, this is a BP graph. BP likes to focus on things that emphasize the necessity for more oil and gas. You do see there's a fairly strong link here to what's going on with GDP growth and decline. Where do we see renewable energy in Europe? There are some regions of Europe that are way out. in advance. The darker the blue, the more renewables you have in your system. Scandinavia leads. If you are in Norway, if you are in Sweden, if you are in Finland, you've got huge amounts of hydropower, you're doing really well on renewables. If you are in some of the regions where you would expect more, like the Netherlands, you know, the place of windmills. Netherlands has a lot to do because they, of course, are also a gas company, a country. Gas company. It's okay. I gotta stop talking. Yeah, okay. Anyhow, you get the picture. We'll keep going. Here you see it by country. And I want to very quickly, without stealing the German talk, what's going to come in a minute, say one of the things we're seeing in Europe are differences between the targets and what's actually happening in the real world. So Germany has very ambitious targets for how to deal with its emissions. It wants to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050. And it's supposed to reduce them by 40% by 2020. It's not going to happen. So what's Germany going to do? I love this talk about Canada is going to go to California and buy up its extra initiatives. Germany's going to have to do the same if it's going to meet its 40% reduction target. What you can see here is that there has been a trend downward, but in the last years it's kind of stabilized. And the problem is not the growth of renewables. Germany's doing great there. Germany, for the first time in its history, on January 3rd, I believe, completely supplied its electricity from renewables. First time ever in Germany's history. Of course, it was right after New Year's and not that many people were working, but it's still an incredibly impressive development. But on the whole, you still see big problems. Transportation sector hasn't really seen that much change. And we still have a huge amount of coal in the system. Germany's been phasing out nuclear, but it hasn't been phasing out coal. And this is where the EU politics becomes interesting. Germany's been pushing its model of an energy transition in the European Union. Phase out nuclear, build renewables, and keep quiet on coal. France and the UK have come back to challenge Germany. And right after the Bonn climate conference that I just mentioned to you, an alliance was formed. Canada, you're part of our problem. Angola, Austria, Belgium, UK, Canada, Costa Rica, Denmark, El Salvador, Fiji, Finland, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Netherlands, New Zealand, Niue, did you even know that existed? Portugal and Switzerland. Countries that don't have that much coal themselves or have lots of nuclear are ganging up on Germany. This is the anti-coal alliance, which is actually terrific, and I'm very happy it's happening because we've been pushing from within in Germany to try to get the government to change, and it's just not listening. Getting a little bit more pressure from outside could be very good. Here you see what that looks like. The area that is singled out in orange is the coal alliance, where they're going to cut out of coal. And right next to them, this big blue area is how much of the coal capacity that is in Europe that's coming from Germany. That's the big challenge. And here we see one of Europe's big problems for the idea of harmonization. Some countries have a lot of coal, some countries have a lot of hydro, and some countries have a lot of nuclear. And it's the difference between those national energy structures that influences a lot where you put your emphasis on how to make a transition. France is 73% dependent on nuclear. When you say phase out nuclear, France looks at you and says, In Germany, nuclear will be completely phased out in 2022. That's around the corner. Trying to do a phase out of coal and nuclear at the same time is politically and economically challenging. Next door to Germany is Poland. Poland is also very, very dependent on a single energy source. 75% of its electricity, more or less, is coming from coal. You tell Poland phase out of coal and they look at you just like France does with nuclear and they say, And that's where we have some of our biggest challenges in Europe in moving forward. Very fortunately, China is starting to overtake the EU in climate leadership. And why do I say very fortunately? Because it's going to put more pressure on Europe to move forward again. And with the US stepping out of the climate agreement, the EU-China relationship will be very, very important on how to move forward. Very briefly, the city level is also pretty exciting to look at. There are over 5,000 cities in the European Union that have shaken hands and said, we're going to move forward on this climate pact and develop our own local city initiatives, and hopefully that will bring about some more change. Next and last, the next climate negotiations, moving forward on the rule book for how to implement the Paris Agreement, will be taking place in Poland in 2018 in December in Katowice. And it will be a very important session because the rule book for how to get to the goals will be developed there. And one of the big things that we're going to be looking at are the targets that are being set by individual countries sufficient. Hopefully, it will also put some pressure on Poland as the host country to put climate change above its domestic coal interests. Thank you.